The City of the Seven Hills. You can compare Richmond with Rome if you will, with an allusion upon the side to her seven hills. But if you have even a remote desire for originality, you will not. Rather compare the old southern capital with a bit of rare lace, or a stout bit of mahogany. Of the two, we would prefer the mahogany, for Richmond is substantial rather than diaphanous. And like some of the fine old tables in the dining rooms of her great houses, she has taken some hard knocks, and in the long run come out of them rather well. She is scarred, but still beautiful, and she wears her scars, visible and invisible, both bravely and well. But if a man come down from the north with any idea of the histories of that war, which is now 50 years old and almost ready to be forgotten too sharply in his memory, and so imagines that he is to see a Richmond of 1865 with grass growing in the streets, ruins everywhere, mules and Negroes in the streets, he is doomed to an awakening. There are still plenty of mules and Negroes in the streets and probably will be until the end of time, but the Richmond of today boasts miles and miles of as fine, modern, smooth pavements as his motor car might ever wish to find. And as for ruins, bless you, Richmond has begun to tear down some of the buildings which she built after the war so as to get building sites for her newest skyscrapers. Do not forget that there is a new spirit abroad in the South and in Virginia, in many ways the most poetic and dramatic of all our states, and has not lagged in it. There are boards of trade at Roanoke and Lynchburg that are not averse to sounding the praises of those lively manufacturing towns of the upcountry, and as for Norfolk, let any Norfolk man get hold of you, and in 2 hours he will have almost convinced you that his town is going to be the greatest seaport along the North Atlantic, and that within 2 decades, sir. But this chapter is not written of Roanoke or Lynchburg or Norfolk. This is Richmond's chapter, and in it to be writ the fact that the capital of Virginia has not lagged in enterprise or progress behind any of the other cities of the state. In the transformation, she has sacrificed few of her landmarks, none of that delightful personality that makes itself apparent to those who tarry for a little time within her gates. That makes it all the better. It is the spirit of the New South that is not only bringing such wonderful towns as Birmingham, to make a single instance, to the front, but is working the transformation of such staunch old settlements as Memphis or Atlanta or Richmond. Not that Richmond is willing to forget the past. There is something about the Virginia spirit that seems incapable of death. There is something about the Virginian's loyalty to his native state, his blindness to her imperfections, almost every one of them the result of decades of civic poverty, that cannot escape the most calloused commercial soul that ever walked out of North or South. And there is something about this bringing up of spirit and of loyalty with the spirit of the new America that makes a combination well nigh irresistible. Here, then, is the New South, the generation that liked to discuss the details of Pickett's charge and the horrors of those days in the wilderness is gone. The new generations are rather bored with such detail. The new generations are not less spirited, not less loyal than the old, but they are new. That, of itself, almost explains the difference. Now see it in a little closer light. Volumes have been written of the loyalty of the Old South. Richmond herself today presents more volumes, although unwritten, of that loyalty. You can read it in her streets, in her fine old square houses, in that stately building atop of Shockoe Hill, which generations have known as the capital, and which was for a little time the seat of government of a new nation. Within that capital stands a statue. It is the marble effigy of a great Virginian who was himself the first head of a new government. The guidebooks call it the Houdon statue of Washington, and keen critics have long since asserted that it is not only the finest statue in the United States, but one of the most notable artworks of the world. It was known as such in France at the time of the Civil War, and hardly had that very dark page in our history been turned before the Louvre made overtures to Virginia for the purchase of the Houdon statue. The matter of price was not definitely fixed. France, in the spendthrift glories of the Second Empire, was willing to pay high for a new toy for her great gallery. Poor Virginia, she was hard-pressed those days for the necessities of life, to say nothing of its ordinary comforts. Her pockets were empty, she was bankrupt, her mouth must have watered a bit at thought of those hundreds of thousands of French francs. But she stood firm, and if you know Virginia at all, you will say, of course she stood firm. A Southern gentleman would almost repudiate his financial obligations before he would sell one of the choice possessions of his family's. There are great plantation houses still standing in the Old Dominion, which were spared the torch of war by the mercy of God, and whose walls hold aloft the handiwork of the finest painters of England in the 17th and 18th centuries, rare portraits of the masters and mistresses of those old houses. In them, too, are furniture and silver whose real value is hardly to be computed, not even by the screw of a dealer in antiques. The folk in these old houses may be poor. If they come of the oldest Virginia stock, they very likely are. They stand bravely, though, to the traditions of their hospitality, even though they wonder if the bacon is going to last and if it is safe for the brood to kill another chicken. But they would close their kitchen and live on berries and on herbs before they would part with even the humblest piece of silver or of furniture. While if a dealer should come down from Washington or New York and make an offer, no matter how generous, for one of the paintings, he would probably be put off the place. Family means much to these Virginians. If you do not believe this, go to Richmond, stop in one of its fine houses, and make your host take you to one of the dances for which the city is famed. Almost any dance will do, and from the beginning you will be charmed. The minor appointments will approach perfection, and you will find the men and women of the city worthy of its best traditions. Some places may disappoint in their well-advertised charm, but the girls of Richmond never disappoint. Here is one of them. She gets you in a quiet corner of the place, meets a friend over there, and a conversation somewhat after this fashion gets underway. "Miss Rhett, allow me to introduce my friend, Mr. Blinkins of New York." You bow low and ask Miss Rhett if by any chance she is related to the Rhetts of Charleston. "Only distantly. My people are all Virginians. The Charleston Rhetts are quite another branch. My grandfather's brother married a Miss Morris from Savannah, and the Charleston Rhetts all come from them. If my papa were only here, he would explain. You say that you understand and murmur something about having met a Richard Henry Rhett at the old colonial town of Williamsburg a few years ago when you were down for the Jamestown Exposition. He was a Petersburg Rhett, the young lady explains, son of a cousin of my father. He married Miss Virginia Tredegar last year. You remember hearing of a Miss Virginia Tredegar of Roanoke, and you slip out that fact. But this is Miss Virginia Tredegar of Weldon, and a cousin of Miss Virginia Tredegar of Roanoke. Miss Virginia Tredegar of Weldon, now Mrs. Richard Henry Rhett, of course, is a delightful girl. The young lady who has you in the corner assures you that, and she herself is not lacking in charms. Mrs. Rhett was a sponsor for the state for several years, and you vaguely wonder just what that may mean as you have visions of large floats lumbering along in street parades with really lovely girls in white standing upon them. And you also have visions of the Miss Virginia Tredegar of Weldon sitting in the other days upon the doorsteps of an old red and white colonial house which faces a hot little open square, visions of her accomplishments and her beauty, of her ability to ride the roughest horse in the county, to dance 7 hours without seeming fatigue, of the jealous beaux who come flocking to her feet. You find yourself idly speaking of these visions to your companion. She laughs. "I've just the right girl for you," she says, "and she is here in this ballroom. She is all these things, and some more. The rightest, smartest girl in all our state, Miss Virginia Beauregard, daughter of Mr. Calhoun Beauregard of Bell Manor in King and Queen County." Apparently, they are all named Virginia in Richmond. Seemingly, 3/4 of these girls who live in the nicer parts of the town are thus to bespeak, through their lives, the affectionate loyalty of their parents to the Old Dominion. All these folk come quite easily to the transformation that has come over the South within the decade since she ceased to grieve over a past that could never be brought back and overcome. The young boys and young girls turn readily from fine horses to fine motor cars. The coming of imported customs causes few shocks. It is even rumored that the newest of the new dances have invaded the sober drawing rooms of the place. But the New South is kind to Richmond. She does not seek to eliminate the Old South, and so the old customs and the old traditions run side by side with the new, and even the old families seem to soften and many times to welcome the new. If you wish to see the real Old South in Richmond, go out to Hollywood Cemetery, which is perhaps the greatest of all its landmarks. It is easy of access, very beautiful, although not in the elaborate and immaculate fashion of Greenwood at Brooklyn or Mount Auburn just outside of Boston. But where man has fallen short at Hollywood, nature has more than done her part. She rounded the lovely hills upon which Richmond might place the treasure chest of her memories, and then she swept the finest of all Virginia rivers, the James, by those hills. Man did the rest. It was man who created the roadways and who placed the monuments, and not the least interesting of these is the strange tomb of President James Monroe, an imposing bronze structure, in these days reminding one of an enlarged birdcage. It is interesting, perhaps, because nearby there is another grave, the grave of still another man who came to the highest office of the American people. The second grave is marked by a small headstone, scarcely large enough to accommodate its two words, John Tyler. But more interesting than these older monuments is the group that stands alone at the far corner of the cemetery, and atop one of those little hillocks close beside the river, the head of that family is buried beneath his effigy. It is the grave of Jefferson Davis, who stands facing the city as if he still dreamed of the days that might have been but never were. And close beside is the grave of his little girl, the daughter of Confederacy. When she died only a few years since, the South felt that the last of the living links that tied it with the days when men fought and died for the lost cause had been severed. It was then that it set to work to build the new out of the old. Nowadays, the Old South does not come publicly into the streets of Richmond, save on that memorable occasion in the spring of 1907, when a feeble trail of aging men, all that remained of a great gray army, limped down a triumphant path through the heart of the town. The Old South sits in her dead cities, and perhaps that is the reason why the Southerner so quickly takes the stranger within his gates to the cemetery. It is his apologies for 30 or 40 years lost in the march of progress, and it is an apology that no man of breadth or generosity can refuse to accept. Here, then, is the new Richmond, riding stoutly upon her great hills and shooting the tendrils of her growth in every direction, for she is growing rapidly and handsomely. Her new buildings, her wonderful cathedral, her superb modern hotels, the fine homes multiplying out by the Lee statue. What self-respecting southern town does not have a Lee statue? All bespeak the quality of her growth, but her new buildings cannot easily surpass the old. It was rare good judgment in an American town for her to refrain from tearing down or even modernizing that Greek temple that stands atop of Shako Hill, and which generations have known as the Capitol. The two flanking wings, which were made absolutely necessary by the awakening of the Old Dominion, have now robbed the older portion of the building of one whit of its charm. It typifies the Old South and the New South come to stand beside one another. In other days, Virginia was proud of her capital. It was with no small pride that she thrust it ahead when a seat of government was to be chosen for the Confederacy, that for a little time she saw it take its stormy place among the nations of the world. In these days, Virginia may still be proud of her capital town. It is still a seat of government quite worthy of a state of pride and of traditions.